It's good to be here. Thank you to the team here for hosting me. It's been really exciting being part of this platform. To be amongst people who understand the process of making art with light and exploring light in various ways is always enriching. And I'm hoping that in today's presentation I can talk about a combination of things, but I'm going to try to string it through with my exploration of light and questions of light and engagement of light as well, so that it's not in a vacuum around only socially engaged art and South African practice, but maybe a few examples in Europe and a few examples on the continent, and try to bring together a series of works I've done over the years that will hopefully illustrate a point that talks about whether or not as artists we need to hold on to this notion of making art as the most important component or proclaiming it as art, or sometimes maybe the notions of activism, maybe the notions of non-art making is just as important in order just to find a voice in this chaos that we live in. So with that very loose introduction, I'm going to get right into it, and I'm going to introduce where I come from. South Africa, just in case you know, all the way at the bottom. A city called Johannesburg. The reason why I show this slide in presentations is because it positions a huge continent between where we are now and where I live. And the reality is that even though South Africa is a very complex space that's gone through an apartheid system that a lot of you will have understood, that has got a very vocal and active audience that needs change and is constantly revolutionizing and questioning and decolonizing spaces, etc., which is very necessary in our context. It's a very violent and dangerous place, as you hear in the media, and often I get asked, why are you living there because of all of this? And my answer is obviously a very positive one, because I'm South African, and because I'm very proud of the place that I'm in, and because I really believe in the people that are there. And so that belief in people and the ability to remap and rethink and reinvent oneself on a daily basis is a really, really important thing. As you can see, I'm a white South African, so this immediately positions me in a certain way. Sometimes I get treated as a tourist in my own city. People look at me and go, yeah, but where are you really from? And I go, well, you know, I'm really from here. This is my home. And I think it's a very important question that I'm constantly asked, because I guess like a little flame or a torch, you know, I stand out at times when I don't want to. While if I'm in Europe, in a German-speaking country, I speak German. I went to the German school in Johannesburg, and so when I walk through the streets of Hildesheim, for example, I can disappear, and it's so beautiful to disappear because I look German. And I look white. And it's all very different. But what I don't do is ask myself the critical question, why I'm here. In Johannesburg, I constantly ask myself the question, who am I, why am I there, and what's my responsibility in what I do? Whether I'm an artist or something else, I'm living in a place of harsh challenges, of extreme contrasts, of poverty and wealth. And somewhere along the line, I have to make a decision why I'm there and what I do. And so part of that optimism that I have about a place of Johannesburg and South Africa is that people invent things, they create out of every street corner, everything from an internet cafe to a market, to a butcher, to a surgery. You know, it all happens at every street corner. There is opportunity and inspiration everywhere. So as an artist, I don't have to go very far to find that inspiration. I turn the corner and I see a public artwork made by very famous South African artists called Eduardo Villa in the 70s that stands in a park. At the time, it was important to have a sculpture because it told us that this is an important park with an important artist that made work. Now this artwork has got multiple functions, and it makes it more appropriate for today, because the notion of art is not necessarily one that should be in our context, the way we celebrate it in this park. Here, the homeless guy has a shelter, he can hang up his clothes, but also the graffiti artists can use it to write their notes on it for the next graffiti artist. And so public art starts to get multiple functions. So we start asking the critical question, what does it mean to make public art? Do we put up big statues of politicians, or do we ask people what they want, and do we engage people in large questions around how do we want to transform our urban spaces? I come from a place where the place itself was built by an oppressive government. The place itself was built by foreigners. The people that are now occupying those spaces look at the space and say, we don't own it. It was built by someone else. So we have to totally reinvent what this public space is. We have to totally reinvent what it means to make public art and say, maybe public art should be put aside and we are just going to think of making places that people can own so that they feel comfortable in a place where they were once oppressed, where they weren't allowed to go, where they were beaten, where they were tortured. And so that challenge is a massive one. On top of that, the challenge is that we get foreign Africans from all over the country flooding into South Africa, all over the continent, flooding into South Africa. And they walk in the public spaces, and they also don't own the space, because it belongs to those South Africans. I'm from Zimbabwe. That's not my space. So why do I need to take care of it? So these layers, as you can see, are maybe layers that are common in globalized thinking, but we see them on a daily basis. So when we commission public art, and this is what my company does a lot, the Trinity Session, the collective you refer to, it's a collective of artists, but what we've done over the last 20 years, we've found new economic models to try and support the arts. And one of them is through a public art policy and developing public art strategies. And the intention there is, how do we design public art that doesn't get vandalized? Because I can guarantee you, each one of these works that you see on the screen here that have been standing for many, many years in South Africa, in Johannesburg, will stand in some of the most dangerous and complex neighborhoods, and they're still there. They haven't been stolen, they haven't been used as firewood, they are still there. And so there is a critical question to be asked: why are they still there, and how have we managed to sustain that? And the main reason for it is that we've just simply asked people what it is that they want to see their space transform into. What are their stories? And telling stories and embedding stories into art is probably the most powerful way of ensuring ownership and participation. And so it's been, as I said, thousands of interventions and activations with people telling their stories over the last 20 years, trying to shape public spaces throughout South Africa, and we've made a little dent, a tiny dent. And that for me is the most important part, is to acknowledge that there are little moments that can change an industry in some form. So part of our thinking as the Trinity Session has been, how do we take a business model and apply it to this new way of thinking, this activist approach, this way of trying to change something against the grain of how art students are being taught, of how the art industry in the gallery world and the gallery system is operating, on how the museums show the practice. How do we go against that grain and still make it sustainable? So we look at business models, we look at value chains, and we say, how can these value chains really empower a connection? Now, this is a kind of a long introduction to something that just gives you a little bit of a position who I am with that hat, someone that tries to think critically about my space. But I want to give you another side to who I am, and that is the artist that likes to play, that likes to make art for art's sake sometimes and disappear in the studio and in the museum, because it's also important for me to keep that balance. And while I was making a lot of this cell phone art and internet art, which is all light-based, obviously, for many, many years, and I was very excited by the screen that blinks and that does beautiful things, and the LEDs, well, at the time it was light bulbs, that were shining at me, and creating computer-generated work and drawing with light, etc., or analogically capturing light with light-sensitive paper in different spaces throughout the city of Johannesburg. These were early experiments for me where I realized light was a really important medium that I would like to play with and tangibilize, if that's a word, somehow, make tangible. And as I was playing with it, I had a little bit of a crisis, a personal moment where, and I think this presentation might get a little bit personal. If I start crying, forgive me. But I had a moment where I guess it was an early midlife crisis. I'm not that old yet. But in that moment, I had to get away and I had to escape these realities I was dealing with in Johannesburg, dealing with very impoverished people, working in public space transformation. It's a hard job. It's not easy walking through townships where poverty is really extreme, as an example. And I chose to climb Kilimanjaro. I still don't know why. But while I climbed Kilimanjaro, I thought I'm going to have the epiphany that I need, that'll change my life. And it wasn't at the top when I saw the sunrise and I thought this was going to be the moment. But it was actually on the summit, on the way up. I had a moment while the sun was setting and I could see the lights of the city coming on at the base city of Moshi, quite far away. But it was a beautiful blanket of lights. And as it got darker and darker, the stars came out. And it looked like a tunnel of light. And in that moment, I was suspended between these two planes, these two spaces that were capturing me. And I asked myself, well, where am I positioning myself as an artist? Do I go into that space where I make art for art's sake and float between the stars and contemplate the world from another perspective? Or do I bed myself in the city lights, trying to bring light into the shadows and trying to engage with people? And at that moment, light really became an integral part of my practice. And I would argue that a lot of my work since then has got some element of light in it. As a hobby, I now climb volcanoes. That's, whenever I come close to a place where there's a volcano, I need to climb it and I need to take a photograph of the light. So this is Mount Taide. in the Canary Islands. This is taking a picture as the sun is behind me, and the volcano you can see in the mist in front, the shadow of the volcano. And it just became a real passion to try and understand what it means to keep on being suspended in that space and bouncing between these two planes of light. So obviously I go and I deal with a lot of scientists to ask them, well, tell me about the stars. I'm understanding the city. I work with urbanists, but I want to know more about what's up there. And so while I'm looking up and looking down with archaeologists, I contemplate how light actually gives us a sense of time. Looking up, it takes time for the light of the stars to hit our eyes. Looking down, we move the dust away from under our feet and we're looking back in time, like archaeologists. And there's something about making space for that light to really create what I call the vertical gaze, looking back in time in both directions. And so I've been fascinated by that vertical gaze, and I collaborate with some instruments that help me look even further. So this is Sumandila-Sat, South Africa's satellite service, that's helped me look and create new works to give me perspective on the world. And so using these instruments, using methods of experimentation, I disappear into another stratosphere sometimes. But then on other times I look back and I engage in physical space. So a few examples of actually being in a physical space like Dakar, working on building projections recently, last month actually, in December 2017, with my collaborator Stephen Hobbs on the Trinity session, doing light projections on inflatables in Cameroon, talking about the speculation of dreams and testing dreams and asking questions about dreaming and how the informality of light allows us to do that. Blacking light out. This is at the Canary Islands, saying it was part of a project that dealt with migration issues from West Africa to Europe. And what we were saying, if the Canary Islands could be blacked out, if there was no light coming from the islands, the immigrants coming on the boats wouldn't see the island at night, and they would drown somewhere else, and they wouldn't be the problem of the Canary Islands. And so it was quite a political piece to actually black out the windows and ask the mayor to turn off all the lights for the night. Obviously, he never did that. But symbolically, it was a really important thing to ask people, what happens when you decide to turn off the light at night and make yourself invisible to those people coming across the ocean, needing that beacon of light? And so, again, when I relook at my portfolio of work in light of this presentation, I'm picking up on a lot of light-based metaphors or stories that are coming through. But common to all of them, and I haven't gone into the detail of the ones that I've shown you so far, has been this process of engagement to understand when dialogue becomes form. And there was a really interesting moment in 2015 when we were working in Linz as part of the Ars Electronica. They commissioned us to do a project, and we decided not to use any technology, but rather ask the people that were arriving in Linz, with the immigrants coming, what they would like to see as a welcoming gesture to happen to them, so that, most of them said they need a bed or they need food, etc. But when we asked the immigrants living in Linz, they turned around and said, well, we wish that there was some way of manifesting a place that belonged to us. And all that we could think of at that time was one path that was leading through the park that hadn't been named yet. And we said, well, let's ask the mayor if we can name that road based on the names that the immigrants were giving this street. And during the turmoil of the refugee crisis, we were able to get this passed as Der Weg der Begegnung. It was a path of encounters. It was a name given to this path by hundreds of immigrants that came together and decided on a common name with a jury. And this was a really exciting process, and we had lots of workshops. It was a 4-month dialogue and very engaged with thousands of people. We were very kind of connected there, and it was interesting process. But there was a moment when a Syrian refugee said to me while we were sitting having a coffee, and he said to me, you know what, in Europe you want our treasures but not our people. And it kind of struck me for a moment. I said, explain more. And he told me about, the conditions that ISIS was busy selling pieces of the treasures to Europe and North America and making money to fund the war. And he said, there's a huge problematic situation there. And so, struck by that comment, I said, well, let's bring your treasures into the spaces. Let's explore what it means. So we did everything from little maquettes of what we thought the treasures were, the buildings that were lost, the places that were destroyed, and we projected them with little torches and shadows in different public spaces in Linz, just to try and ask the question, how is Linz going to change as a new population comes in? But then the real magic happened when we went into the museum, the Weltmuseum in this case in Vienna, looking for artifacts from Syria. And we used torch to shine at these objects and create shadow landscapes. And these shadow landscapes reminded these immigrants of a destroyed Aleppo, for example. And it was a very emotional moment standing in the dark storerooms of a museum, looking at shadows of artifacts that once were in another place, that have now, where the original has now been destroyed. And it was a very complex condition. And it's in that way that I've found more and more interest in filming the storerooms of artifacts that sit, everything from the Smithsonian Museum of African Art to the museum here in Hildesheim, where there are objects and artifacts that are no longer on the African continent, that float around somewhere, and we have no access to them because they're hidden away most of the times like treasures. And what happens if we relook them? What happens if we create shadowscapes out of them, as shadow landscapes, and imagine where these objects actually come from? And so the series of work started that were really investigations into foreign museums to see how these objects, or the shadows of these objects, can become landscapes that help us imagine where the objects are from and help us speculate a little bit. And so while these shadow landscapes, and I'm going to just skip through some of these videos because they're quite long, are quite abstract, I then in the studio take them and try to make work out of them, because of course I need to make art for art's sake sometimes, and I try to articulate them by painting them, by projecting them large and creating these strange escaped spaces that remind me a little bit of spaces that the satellites sometimes send, images that the satellites sometimes send me, foreign ideas and spaces that help me make sense of my own context. And these take form of installations at time where I use real or fake objects, and then become two-dimensional, or actually project three-dimensional projections. And while these are all fun and nice, and I have a lot of fun making them, and I get nice and dirty, they have a critical position as well. And I then take these works and I reinsert them into museums. So in this case, working with the Cairo Museum of Antiquities, I went and I filmed in Cairo the collections and their different components. And one of the amazing things that I found, and I actually brought these two little figures with me for you today, is Queen Nefertiti is no longer in Cairo. She sits in Berlin. Some of you will know this if you are from Berlin. She looks more like this than like this. And I went there and I thought, I have to see this bust, because this is still one of the biggest souvenir sellers in Cairo. Even though she no longer sits there, she sits in Berlin. And so I got this from a seller in Cairo, and I said, can I buy this from you? And he said, sure, it's made in Cairo. And then when I went to Berlin, I bought this in the museum shop. This is a 3D scanned and a computer rendered and then cast version. And my question to you is, which one is more authentic? Which copy is more authentic? The one made in Cairo that doesn't look like anything like the Queen, or the one that's made by a 3D scan? And those are the kind of complexities that I enjoy playing with and asking critical questions of, especially when walking through these kinds of museums. And so we did the same thing here in Hildesheim. We took torches and we went through the collections and we filmed shadowscapes of the collection, trying to make sense of what it means to be looking at these collections from a different perspective. What does it mean to make shadow landscapes in a place, about a place that you don't actually know? And in this way, forms have emerged, shapes have come and gone, and this is then projected onto the on the outside of the facade, where I'm hoping to stimulate the imagination of people. I've had amazing responses, not only to the Egyptian version, which you can obviously see the beautiful landscape, and just now you'll see the little camels coming over the hill. This is kind of the imaginary space that we occupy. But I had incredible response also to the Chinese exhibition, or the Chinese porcelain exhibition that we made shadow landscapes of, that sits in the museum. Now, the Chinese porcelain exhibition is valuable for... This, by the way, is a recording of a Chinese soundtrack in a China shop in Johannesburg. Because I thought it sounds like China, it must be China. And so for me it's about, exactly, you laugh, but it's those bizarre speculations that we have about a place that sometimes ill-inform us when we make judgment calls on others that have joined us in our cities. But it's my playful way of trying to make sense of a place that I don't know. Now, China is interesting to me because it's speculated that China is the new colonial power of Africa. So if I see a collection of Chinese artifacts in a museum, I really need to understand that landscape. And so we went with the torches, we created the landscape, and then I destroyed the objects in the collection. The idea was that I smashed them, and in smashing them, draw reference to the value of these objects or the lack of value that they have. Is it our right to destroy these objects? Now that we have them in our collection, are they our artifacts or do they belong to someone else? Now I'm giving you this as a little anecdote to what I think about when I am in these collections, looking at them from an outside perspective and trying to make sense of a landscape. In a lot of the collections that I've done this in, so this is, for example, at the Carlos Museum in Atlanta. They've got an incredible collection of Egyptian artifacts as well, and African artifacts. I do the video, and I walk with curators through the dark storerooms, and they watch me with the torches because they're worried that the South African's going to steal everything. And we walk and we explore the landscapes, and they start sharing the stories. They start talking about the collections. They ask critical questions. And by the end of this, I hand over a film to them, which is the landscape. But also what I do is I try to insert something new into the museum. And so one of the beautiful things at the Atlanta Museum, at the Carlos Museum in Atlanta, was they had a lot of boxes, obviously, with the objects inside. And then they had the exhibition, so they took the objects out. So what was left were a lot of these boxes in the storeroom. So I asked them whether I could have one of these boxes, or a few of them. And they gave me 5 boxes. And I ended up drawing imaginary objects that used to be in the boxes onto them. And I gave the boxes back to them in the form of art. I said, your boxes are now valuable. They are a contemporary art piece. And I would like you to keep them in the collection, very safe. And they were very grateful. Wow, there's a contemporary artist that gave us a contemporary piece for our traditional collection. And 6 months later, I got a question how I would like them to package these boxes, because they are storage boxes. And so the dialogue becomes really exciting. So the intervention into the museum becomes a really fun thing. So what did I do here in Hildesheim is I went to the museum shop, and I just decided to buy some objects in the museum shop. Funny enough, right next to each other, there's, in the souvenir section of the museum shop, there is a book with the Queen of Nefertiti on it, with beautiful paper that you can paint in, and then a wonderful Chinese ink set. And so I bought those 2 things a few days ago, and I spent a sleepless night tracing and drawing the shadow landscapes that we discovered over the last few nights in the museum into this little book. And yesterday I donated the book back to the museum. And apparently they're now going to give it an acquisition number, or a reference number, and it's now going to live in the museum. So the museum shop object, the thing that's a souvenir, like this, has now got a little place in this museum. And I'm very excited by that, because it means that I'm playing the same game, I guess, that the museum collection has been playing with the artifacts that it has from various cultures. And so that playful experimentation with collections and space is something that has taken me in various directions. But this, I would like to share with you, maybe as the last stream of thinking, my interest in this in China, and the kind of story of light that comes through it. So China is everywhere in South Africa. In Africa, every little street's got some kind of China shop. And what I've been doing is I've been going into these China shops buying cheap lights. And the main reason for doing that is because I'm interested in how, through these speculative light drawings, we can let people tell their stories. We can let people play and experiment. Because when it's dark, people love to talk and play. When it's light, they feel awkward. They don't want to engage. They want to kind of step back and rather be witness. And so what I've done over the last approximately about 8 years is I've done over 50 interventions throughout South Africa, going to small remote towns and allowing people to tell their stories with light, going to the local China shops and asking people to participate using the lights that we found there and create some statements. I've just come back from Merida for the second time, where I've been doing a light performance. And talking about engaged practices, someone came to me and said, you know, the headdress of Montezuma that should be in Mexico actually sits in Vienna. And you talk about cultural heritage in our country and how it's missing. We need to bring back this headdress. So I said, sure, let's take 200,000 glow sticks and let's bring it back. And so what we did for one night is we made this beautiful Montezuma headdress that became an engagement and a process, and people came together. 1,000 people were part of this participation for the night, and we swept it around this space, and we created big trees of light out of it, etc. It was really exciting, and it became an interesting, fun statement around, I guess, also China in Mexico, but also around these cultural exchanges and these objects. I'm going to skip forward a little bit through some of these images, which are engagement images of a project in a small town in the Karoo where there's an observatory, and where my partner Bronwyn Lace and I have done many projects in creating an observatory for the people, talking about forced removals, etc. And I'm going to skip to a project that really shaped, again, my playing with light. So it wasn't necessarily looking through the telescope that was important, but it was asking the community at the foot of this telescope, what do they do in that telescope? And they said, well, they study the Big Bang. So I said, well, what is the Big Bang? And they all looked at me with big eyes saying, I don't know. I don't know what the Big Bang is. So I said, well, can we imagine what it could be? And so what we then did, using lights from Chinatown, we created this light intervention where literally this group of youth was spinning the lights around them, simulating, sorry, there's a bit of sound there, simulating the movement of these planets like the Big Bang. And I'm up on a water tower photographing downwards, and then capture in long-time exposure photographs what their Big Bang looks like. So this image is generated by the people living at the foot of this observatory, telling the story in light. And this process has continued throughout South Africa, talking about forced removals, talking about shifting communities, etc. And I've asked people to really be critical about their landscape and play and experiment. I don't say we're making art, I just encourage them to explore using light. And so a lot of these, I could tell you a story about each one of these photographs, but a lot of them are very personal, a lot of them are very context and site-specific. They're about communities and the complexities. And it's been so well received that we even had a stamp sheet made with all these little photographs of people's stories by the South African Post Office in order to tell stories with light of South Africa's history and South Africa's people. But what happens to these wonderful lights when they die? So in the last few minutes, I'm going to show you what happens. I have these light performances. I have by now 500,000 dead glow sticks in my collection. I've got LED lights, I've got tubes, etc. And my objective is to take all these wonderful lights that look like this at the beginning of an installation and like that at the end, where there's one last one that's still making a noise or moving, and I then turn them into artifacts. Here I'm making art for art's sake. I'm recycling these objects. And the main reason why I recycle them, not because I'm interested in making new objects, but actually because I want to send them back to China. I want to return the trash back to where it came from, because essentially I don't want to fill our landfills in South Africa with the crap that they send us, I use. So at the moment I've got a wonderful storeroom full of objects and artifacts. I've got a few potential museums and galleries interested in hosting them in China, and I literally have created these things. These are the tubes, for example, that hold the glow sticks. These are glow sticks that have been melted down and cast into objects that hopefully Chinese will want to buy. You're laughing. I'm happy you're laughing because it's meant to be a question, not necessarily, well, I don't know. Maybe they'll buy them. We'll see. Anyway, shark fins. Yeah, shark fin soup. Why not? Yeah. And so this experimentation has continued. You can imagine using South African craft techniques and working with teams of crafters. We've created the most amazing maps of China, or maps of the world by China, looking back in time. But very importantly, we've also looked at collections of objects that have already had Chinese artifacts incorporated into the design. And we came up with a bunch of prosperity dolls, not fertility dolls, prosperity dolls, because the relationship with China should be a good one. And so I'm hoping that these prosperity dolls will find their way into some kind of prosperous relationship with China. If you'll indulge me for another 2 minutes, I would like you to share one more work with you. And the reason why I'd like to do that is because yesterday I made a statement, and I've added this because of that statement, quite aggressively, to say the audience is not always the one that decides whether art is being made by the artist. The artist decides when you make something and whether you want to call it art or not. And I still stand by that simply because I'm really interested in the process that we go through. The story I told you now was threading light through it. And at the end of last year, I had a very meaningful experience. As you might have picked up on all of the works I've shown you now, they all have a question of identity connected to them. And it comes from the fact, as I said right in the beginning, that I am a foreigner in my own country. Even though I'm born and bred there, it is very difficult to find my roots in a place where I know I am forever seen as an imposition because of my personal condition, being the color that I am, speaking the languages that I speak. It doesn't matter how engaged I am in terms of social practices. And so linked to that is the fact that my family is originally from Austria, and they've all moved back. You know, my father passed away, my mother's moved back, life has changed, and as an artist you take that information and you make something of it. Your presentation yesterday inspired me to say, what are those basic things that we remember that we need to sometimes think about as artists? And I did a performance end of last year, which was trying to become the shadow that these objects are that I showed you earlier, to embody myself into that space. Instead of showing you little objects with torches, what if I was part of that process? What if I actually acknowledge that I am an object, just like those things in the museum, and I'm trying to find that identity, I'm trying to find my landscape. And so what I did is I collaborated with Mgwana, who's an incredible dancer and vocalist, but he's the polar opposite of me. He's a dancer, vocalist, black, young, engaged Xhosa person who has got a sense of roots and identity and history in my country, which I don't have. And I was trying to find with my medium and his medium a meeting of the two spaces. It's a very, very vulnerable piece. It is something that's purely improvised. And I'd like to share it with you and close the talk with that. I'm going to skip through the parts of it because it is a bit long and I'm conscious of time. So I'll just pick up on the most important parts. But know that this was a performance that was done in absolute agony, in the sense that as an artist we are vulnerable when we make the work. And I'm curious about that vulnerability. I'm curious when we're reminded of that when we're producing. And very often, as an artist, I like to give that vulnerability to my participants, not my audience, to draw with light. And here, I put it on myself. And so with that, let me share this. It starts with a screen and lights around the screen. The lights go on and off at different speeds. They're on timers, random timers. I start building a shadow landscape. Ngolisi stands on the other side of the screen and is illuminated by the same lights on the other side. I then respond to his movement and his sound. As we interact with each other, I try to capture his form, just like I capture the form of objects and landscapes, artifacts. And as he moves and as it's captured, the image continues until we both decide that we need to meet in a different way. piece continues as before, with the roles reversed, until eventually we meet each other through the screen itself.